Much to the delight of the early harvesters, the morning forecast for August 7th, 1994 for the quaint town of Oakville was naturally predicted to be clear and dry for the entirety of the day. Nothing but warm, sun-filled skies had been the norm for the past week, which sent the distant memory of that spring's rainfall to the back of everyone's minds. Although it was a regular occurrence for moisture to form overnight, usually by morning the dew would typically disappear with the slow emergence of the sun. Though on that particular day, as the majority of the town's residents woke from their peaceful slumbers and walked out their front doors, they realized the world around them was not the same as it had been when they had left it that previous evening. Some of the townsfolk had heard it in the night. Others were completely oblivious to the sudden sounds of crashing coming from outside. To everyone indoors, it just seemed like a freak downpour, something that wasn't necessarily uncommon, but odd nonetheless as the weather had been strictly predicted to remain dry. Which was strange in of itself, but would ultimately pale in comparison once people began to realize what exactly had fallen on their obscure little town that morning. Welcome back everyone to a brand new episode on the Moonlight Lore podcast. As always, I'm your host Jordan Hopkins, and this is the curious case of the mysterious blobs that rained down on Oakville, Washington. Oakville, Washington, like many other small towns in the state, is isolated by the misty boreal forests that dominate the area in every direction. Tracts of farmland rest on the outskirts of its borders, with a single highway running through the north end of the humble community. The spotless, rushing mountain creeks act as veins which flow through and around the town in search of the dominant water source, the Gelatinous River, which acts as its own highway heading towards the Pacific. In every sense of the word, Oakville is the ideal place to find tranquility. The leading industries of the municipality consist of three major players crucial to the early survival of the town as it was being formed: farming, lumber, and railroads. It was with these three pillars would Oakville be built on, and continue to thrive to this very day. Not much has changed since its incorporation back in 1905, but there was one day that stood out amongst the rest. One day was all it took for Oakville to join the history books of the strange and unusual. It was August 6th, 1994, and the residents of Oakville were following the sun's example by turning in and settling down for the evening. It had been a warm summer thus far, and the forecast for tomorrow was said to be just as humid. But nonetheless, the fast approaching autumn was looking to turn out to become ideal for the farmers who hoped for a dry harvest, and the lumbermen whose woodland highways would remain hard and firm for the trucks to haul out timber. To the residents of Oakville, while laying their minds down to rest that night, everything seemed as normal. Driving along the number 12 highway that runs through the north end of town, Officer David Lacey and a friend of his was out on night patrol in his squad car, idly passing by houses and businesses that made up their town. Together they watched the soft green glow of the clock on the dashboard slowly tick by, and both peered out into the illuminated streets lit by the flickering lamps above them. Officer Lacey thought to himself just how peaceful this town truly was. Rare was the occasion when he would actually need to enforce the law on his shift. As a heavy yawn slipped from his mouth, he rubbed his eyes, pondering how the two of them were going to entertain themselves for the next few hours until dawn came. Idle chit-chat can only go so far. Keeping his now blurred eyes on the green numbers ahead of him, he watched as the clock finally changed from 2:59 a.m. to 3. A small game he'd like to play in his downtime, to watch the hour finally change. Stretching out the kink in his neck, Officer Lacey leaned back in his chair, watching the unmoving street. Nothing had changed, except maybe a few spots of rain on his windshield. It may not have been an obvious surprise at first. Nighttime in Washington state often produces a bit of moisture that comes in one moment, then is gone the next. Though something about this rain looked awfully different. It wasn't running down the window like it should normally do. It simply splattered across the glass like it was jello. This was no ordinary rain. Across town, unable to find the rest she desperately craved, an irritated Dottie Heron paced back and forth in her home. Hours of tossing and turning left her feeling restless, which in turn drew her out from her soft, warm bed to mosey about her house, searching for something to occupy her mind. It was nearly 3 a.m. and she was dreading having to wake up in the morning with such little sleep. Turning on the television, she flipped through the channels with hopes of finding some monotonous late-night game show that would bore her enough that the only other alternative was to fall unconscious. As the guide slowly scrolled up the screen, below was the weather forecast for the day and coming week. Nothing but clear skies. This was no news to Dottie. The local farmers in town, her daughter included, were repeatedly commenting on the weather that it became nearly impossible not to know how the day was going to turn out, even without checking the forecast. Which is why she believed it odd that, as soon as she finished that thought, she all of a sudden heard rain hitting her roof and windows. Curious about this sudden downpour, Dottie quickly moved to the window to watch. The pleasant odor of rain and hearing it fall was a far more pleasant pastime than watching bad late-night television anyways, and would surely put her to sleep much faster. As she unlatched her living room window, welcoming the cool, refreshing night air into her home, she all of a sudden was met with an unfamiliar scent. Her senses instantly came under assault by an unknown, offensive odor wafting into her nostrils, carried by the drag of air Dottie had just inhaled. It took a moment for the experience to resonate with her, but despite her fatigued state, she knew that whatever it was that was falling from the sky was certainly not rain in the slightest. Come morning, the residents of Oakville awoke to something out of the ordinary. They couldn't quite place what or how it had occurred, but their once obscure and normal little town had apparently come under siege during the night. Thick, mucus-like blobs were everywhere. It covered people's homes, their vehicles parked on the side of the road, and the trees lining the sidewalks. Everything within 20 square miles was absolutely drenched in small, bubbly goo. As the morning led out and more people began to emerge from their homes to inspect the mysterious substance coating their properties, they questioned one another about what had happened. Of course, nobody knew. The only clues as to how this had occurred was the few statements made by those who had happened to have still been awake during the night. It was as if heavy rain or hail had fallen from the sky, but instead of water and ice, they ended up with the translucent blobs. Understandably, this was quite a unique situation nobody anywhere could have been prepared for. The mounds of goop that had blanketed the region stuck around too. Normally, when the sun comes out, it typically would dry up the rain or the ground soaks it up. But this stuff was different. It stuck around, and to the dismay of the residents of Oakville, once it did eventually disappear, more would fall in its place within the coming weeks. Although the appearance of these odd little blobs was certainly a concerning mystery, it wasn't until people started to grow ill would the situation truly grow bizarre. On that first day, August 7th, while everyone was curiously inspecting the new substance, people began to experience an overwhelming sickness that completely consumed the population. It seemed if anyone came into close proximity of the blobs, they would develop flu-like symptoms that would often leave the suffering host violently sick. Reports of people having difficulty breathing started to flood in. Some folks began collapsing where they stood after feeling faint and lightheaded. Energy was seemingly zapped from many of the patients who had turned up at any nearby hospital or medical center, unable to properly diagnose their own symptoms after growing delirious. Those tending to the rush of residents from Oakville were also quite alarmed to learn of the circumstances that surrounded this sudden plague. Of course, everyone was treated to the best of the doctors' and nurses' abilities, but even they lacked the answers as to what might have caused this. Dottie Heron was among the first who were hospitalized for coming into contact with the goo after touching a small pile that had fallen onto her porch. Her daughter, Sunny Barclift, was forced to rush her mother to the emergency wing of the closest hospital to address the bouts of dizziness and nausea that came over her. The aforementioned man on duty that early morning, Officer David Lacey, later made a statement telling of the moment he and his friend had first encountered the blobs.
"We turned our windshield wipers on and it just started smearing to the point where we could almost not see. And we both looked at each other and we said, 'Geez, this isn't right.' I mean, we're out in the middle of nowhere, basically, and where did this come from?"
Shortly after the blobs began raining down on them, Officer Lacey pulled off to a nearby gas station to clear off his windshield as the thick mucus-like substance had completely coated his car, making it impossible to see out of.
"The substance was very mushy. It's almost like if you had Jell-O in your hand and you could pretty much squish it through your fingers. We did have some bells go off on our heads that basically said this isn't right. This isn't normal."
Later, both Officer Lacey and his friend would be among the first to develop intense flu-like symptoms that would incapacitate the two. In the coming days, dozens more would turn up in hospitals around the region, claiming they had come into contact with a suspicious group of blobs that had fallen from the sky. This was concerning as the original blobs that had fallen were gone by this point and disappeared into the environment. In truth, it wouldn't be just the one day that the blobs fell. Within a span of 3 weeks, it was reported that translucent slime had rained down onto the earth a total of 6 times. Nobody could understand what they were or where exactly they came from. All anybody knew was that if you came into close proximity to them, you would fall violently ill. Horrifically though, this wasn't even the worst of it. While nobody had died from the blobs, many pets and wild animals did. Similar to their owners, dogs and cats grew curious about the sudden appearance of the translucent substance that coated their homes, and unfortunately, many animals ended up ingesting some, resulting in their swift and uncomfortable deaths. As the 3 weeks came and went, and once Oakville was finally free from this bizarre phenomenon, naturally everyone was left wondering what exactly it was that had fallen on their town and plagued their neighbors. Searching for answers, Sunny Barclift approached Dr. Little while visiting McCleary Hospital where she had taken her mother, Dottie. Sunny had brought along some of the substance and explained to Dr. Little that no less than 24 hours prior to her mother's admittance, that she had come into contact with the slime and suddenly fell ill. Dr. Little was puzzled to say the least about this story, so he ordered a lab technician to conduct a few tests and see where it may lead. When the technician returned with the results, everyone was unsettled by their discovery. As it turned out, they had found the substance that had apparently gotten everyone so ill had allegedly contained human white blood cells. Sunny later had this to say about the experience.
Once my mother had pointed out the substance to myself and my brother, we decided to wear gloves because it was an unknown substance. My background is in occupational safety and health, so I opted to wear gloves as a precaution. It is important to note that the gel-like substance, which was clear, no color at all and about the size of rice grains, was literally everywhere, in the grass, on foliage, on my truck window. We probably would not have noticed them, as they would have only appeared as drops of water had my mother not found them on her woodbox. She initially thought they were hail. They were not liquid and had mass and were about 3-dimensional. I became mildly nauseated a week or so after the first fallout. I became acutely ill with severe bronchitis 6 weeks after. My kitten died on or around the 3rd day. It had been reported on some websites that the kitten had digestive problems prior to the fallout, but that is not true. Both my mother's dog fell ill 3 weeks after the first fallout. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. The vet said they had an infection and they were treated with antibiotics. It is important to note at this point the fallout of Gel was not a single occurrence, but instead a series of 6 fallouts over 3 weeks. All were documented by my mother in her journal. There were rumors that some nearby farms experienced the death of larger animals such as horses and cows. I did not investigate those allegations. I have no reason to dispute them, but they are hearsay.
Immediately after learning the blobs could potentially contain human white blood cells, Sonny got into contact with a Dr. Kobayashi at the Washington State Health Laboratory. After hearing about the town's plight, he then requested that she send him a sample of the material so that it could undergo intense study by epidemiologist Mike McDowell. Under rigorous testing, McDowell had set up the slime on bacterial media to see if anything would possibly grow on the samples, to which 2 different types eventually did. One of the samples of bacteria was Pseudomonas fluorescens, and the other Enterobacter cloacae, both of which can be found in the human digestive system and, if abused properly, could have the potential to be harmful to humans. This revelation caused some to believe perhaps that it might have been human excrement that had been released by a passing airliner, though this theory does not quite have a solid stance as many would think. Human bio-waste from airplanes is commonly mixed with a blue disinfectant that freezes at high altitudes, resulting in what is colloquially known as blue ice. Although there is no mechanism that would allow pilots to dump any sort of waste mid-flight, and they are forbidden from doing so even if they could, there are occasional leaks from the plane's septic tanks, but this is rare and any leaks would never make it to the ground, let alone enough to coat an entire town 6 times over. Another reason why this theory wouldn't necessarily hold up in this case is because blue ice is exactly what it is. The translucent wet blobs that had fallen onto Oakville were nothing of the sort. This theory may have been an explanation for the residents of Oakville to consider, but ultimately it couldn't possibly be true. While under scrutiny at the Washington State Health Laboratory, the specimens were kept safely locked away in a containment facility where McDowell would continue his research on the strange substance. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that the blobs had to have been man-made somehow, likely an intentionally created virus. When he finally reported this to his supervisor about the implications to this find, he was utterly shocked and dismayed to find that when he returned back the next day to continue his research, the samples and substance were now missing. Once again, he went to his supervisor to report he may have misplaced them or they were completely stolen, but was then swiftly advised at that point to stop asking questions. Now retired, Mike McDowell has done several interviews about his research into the blobs, and in a relatively recent interview with National Geographic a few years back, he stated it was the first and only time in his 30 years of service with his job that a sample he was responsible for had gone missing. This turn of events at the laboratory sparked a new theory, that whatever the blobs were, they may have been a biological weapon of sorts that was being tested to see the effects on a small population. The strange circumstances of when McDowell believed the blobs to have been man-made and not a natural occurrence, then once he made his discovery, the samples he had been working on then suddenly went missing, caused many people to suspect foul play was involved. But then this opened up a whole slew of other questions. Who developed the blobs, and who might have been responsible for distributing them over Oakville 6 times over the course of 3 weeks? What reason would they have for distributing them? Recounts of military aircraft flying over Oakville during the month of August began to sprout up here and there once this theory began to take hold over a year later. Obviously, the state of Washington has a very large military presence, so seeing military aircraft pass by would not be out of the ordinary. But it is suspicious that many people had said that they had seen black military helicopters and planes either circle above or hover over the town during that time, as if they were dispersing something or perhaps overseeing an operation. Paranoia then began to grow at the notion the government was somehow involved. Unfortunately, no answers in regards to this theory would be brought to light, and any hope in gaining any insight into what the military was up to was all but lost. As the months passed by, Sunny Barclift grew anxious at what the appearance of the Blobs meant for her, her family, and the other residents of Oakville. The mystery had lingered in the air for well over a year since the incident had occurred, and the town was growing restless. In search of an answer, Sunny decided to get into contact with a microbiologist named Tim Davis, who worked at a private research lab called Amtest Laboratories. Luckily, Sunny had the forethought to preserve a scooping of the slime before it had all but disappeared back in August of '94. She had kept it in a freezer and was able to provide a clean, ready sample for Davis to inspect. After a few days, Davis came back saying he believed he had found eukaryotic cells inside the blobs, which can be found in animals, fungi, and plants. Sunny also managed to get into contact with Mike Osweiler at the Department of Ecology, to which he too concluded that it was organic material. They had found a cell with a nucleus, which indicated to them that it was biological, but it also could have been a bacteria of sorts. It was never specified. Continuing to hit roadblock after roadblock with no clear answers to what had plagued Oakville, Sunny relented and found herself accepting she may never know the truth. A couple new theories would pop up here and there, both of which would go on to be rather controversial. One suggested perhaps the translucent blobs could have been, surprisingly, a school of jellyfish. Although Oakville is roughly 50 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean and is surrounded by forest, over the course of the month of August, the US Navy had been conducting bombing runs at sea. People had theorized, obviously desperate for an answer, that the explosions caused by the naval vessel's artillery had thrown an entire school of jellyfish so far into the air they were later dispersed by some passing clouds, only to wind up making landfall in Oakville. Obviously, this goes without saying just how unlikely this would be, and although the Navy did confirm that they had been conducting bombing exercises, they adamantly denied any knowledge of the involvement in creating or dispersing the gelatinous blobs all over the small town. An even more bizarre explanation for what the blobs could have been, but could possibly be the most credible, takes us, surprisingly, all the way back to the 14th century, to when an English physician by the name of John Gelatinous describes the substance in his medical writings. He had encountered the mysterious jelly and believed it might have been used for treating abscesses. Now, obviously, from common knowledge we have today, we know not to pick up strange wet substances off the ground and rub it onto our wounds or injuries. But the folklore surrounding these particular blobs grew into something quite magical, which may have been the reason why some people believe them to have healing properties. The folklore dictates that they were remains from the stars that had fallen during a meteor shower, which earned its name as star jelly. There's not a ton of information about what star jelly might be, only that it's gooey, often translucent with maybe a slight tinge of blue to it, apparently gets absorbed everywhere, only to evaporate in the sun hours later. An exact match to what had fallen over Oakville back in 1994. The mystery still remains, however, what exactly star jelly is, and is it the same stuff that had fallen in Oakville? Over the years, many people have put forth theories that could possibly explain what it is, but overall most are lacking any sort of significance. Some have said it could be a fungus or algae. Others have made the outlandish claim that it could be extraterrestrial in origin. But most prevalent of all, in what seems to be the believed theory, is that star jelly is actually just spawn jelly from frogs or toads that had been vomited up by amphibian-eating predators. After all the information I have covered in this episode, I highly doubt this could be the case of what happened in Oakville. As unconventional as these particular theories might be, they do ultimately serve their purpose. It tells us that the residents of Oakville are still clinging to any sort of clue as to what may have happened that warm summer month back in 1994. Nobody has yet to offer up a credible answer or theory as to what these mysterious blobs really were, where they had come from, and why they had rained down on Oakville a total of 6 times over the course of 3 weeks. The few scientific experts who were drawn to this case were forced to walk away with more questions than answers, and the community of Oakville was forced to wonder, would there be any negative side effects to having touched or been near the gelatinous blobs? Only time will eventually tell. Oakville would quickly move on from the event though. life continues to go on for them. Some members of the community, searching for a way to commemorate the peculiar spectacle, have jokingly suggested the town put together an annual jellyfish festival where they would shoot jellyfish into town with a cannon. This plan did not seem to take off nor resonate with the locals. Nowadays, Oakville is simply the same as it always has been, a quick-stop destination for folks traveling through the sprawling forest highway en route towards the larger cities. If you happen to find yourself in this particular neck of the woods, consider stopping in at the local tavern to enjoy a short tale about the time the blobs fell from the sky, or partake in the unique concoction specifically found only in Oakville, a vodka, gelatin, and juice mixture created to memorialize that day back in August, a local favorite drink known appropriately as the jellyfish. To this day, nobody truly knows exactly what the blobs were or where they had come from. There are really only a handful of theories that may not necessarily resonate with everyone, but may still provide comfort to others. Ultimately, it's an unsolved mystery that continues to tantalize our brains into speculation and wonder. If you enjoyed this episode and wish to see more like this in the future, please consider supporting the show any way you can. The best way you can show your support is by donating to the podcast's Patreon. Up there, I got extra episodes that don't get released onto the main feed, so if you're looking for more Moonlight Lore content, that's the absolute best way to get more. All donations go towards supporting the show by helping cover equipment costs, hosting fees, website hosting, recording software, and so much more. Every little bit helps. If your pocket may be a little tight right now, another great way to show your support is by sharing this episode or any others I've done on social media, or just by telling your friends and family by word of mouth. The more listeners who regularly tune into the show, the better. And finally, by leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening on right now, whether that be iTunes, Spotify, or any other. It goes a long way in helping the show grow on the podcast charts and becoming more noticeable for new listeners to find. Honestly, all the support you guys have given me over the years and continue to give me is really appreciated. Thank you all so much for even listening. And I also want to give a very special thank you to those who support the show financially. Because of them, the show can stay advertisement free, which I really prefer anyways. I don't think I have any extra news to give you guys at the moment. So I guess until the next episode drops, you all stay awesome. Take care, and as always, I'll see you next time.